Welcome to this second video about the sidebar codebase. And in this video, I'm going to talk about the overall code organization, focusing on the client and modules directories. Now, client is going to be fairly quick because it only imports modules. And the reason why that is because in Meteor apps, a lot of the code is actually shared between the client and the server. And in this case, we actually share all our client code with our server, right? There's no client-only code. And the reason is because all the things that you would typically associate with the client, like your React components and so on, are also used on the server for server-side rendering. So in effect, we don't really have any client-only code. We could have, maybe things related to analytics, event tracking, although even that could go into your components. If we had any, it would be in this client directory. But as you can see, there's nothing there besides the entry point into the client bundle, which itself, again, redirects to the modules folder. So let's take a look at modules. The main entry point is this index.js file, and that's just a convention where, it's good to have an index just to summarize all the contents of a directory. I'm going to go a bit, not in any specific order, but just start with the routes, because that's a good way to understand an app. So this file is where we define our app's routes, and as you can see, first I import a bunch of components, and then I assign these components to routes. So the about component is accessible on the /about page, and I name this route about. You can see some of those routes are a bit more complex. They have these parameter placeholders. Some of these are admin only, so they have some access options. They also have like a layout, and the access options just define which groups can access the route and where to redirect the user if they're not part of that user group. So this is a fairly, declarative, fairly standard way of defining routes. These, by the way, get kind of translated into React Router routes, but we don't define them as components or some other weird way. It's kind of fairly simple, and that's kind of how I like to define routes, and that's how Vulkan does it. So yeah, this is a good way to get an overview of every single route in the app. What else do we have here at this root level of the modules folder? We have a components file, and this is used to override core Vulkan components, in this case the 404 component. So if we take a look at that, here it says we call register component, which is just a way of telling Vulkan that we want to use this component instead of the default 404 one. And then we import this file so that that code gets executed. Now, in previous Vulkan apps or previous times, we would kind of import all our components this way and use register component everywhere. But in Sidebar, at least, other components are just defined using regular, import, export, regular JavaScript modules, and they're all imported here in the routes file. What else do we have here? This is just a way to store like statuses and basically any piece of hard-coded data, prices, whatever you want. Nothing special here. GraphQL.js, here we are defining a fragment matcher, which is this weird GraphQL thing you have to do when you want to use unions. And I'm not going to go into too much details, but what we can see here is that this is shared between client and server. So it's used on the client mainly. Helpers, that's just to format, money amounts. And then we have this internationalization file, fairly short currently because sidebar isn't really internationalized. But if we wanted to handle multiple languages, we would register another locale here and then add more strings here, and then obviously call those strings from our UI using the the keys here instead of just calling the English or French or whatever directly in your components, which is more or less the case now. What else do we have? Products. This might change in the future, but currently Sidebar has different Stripe products, and this uses a package called Vulcan Payments. It doesn't do a ton though, so in the future I probably will merge those features into the Sidebar app itself and get rid of this whole product system. Just keep the same functionality, but get rid of the dependency basically. So that's an overview of those the root files here, and then as you can see, the rest is sorted by model, I guess, or at least feature type, and that's how it's usually done in Vulkan apps. There's kind of two ways to organize your code in any app, whether it's Vulkan or anything. One is by type, so all the models together, all the callbacks together, all the routes together. And we do that a little bit and on some level, such as in routes, but mostly we do here in Vulkan, we sort things by feature or model, where all the features related to posts are grouped together, all the features related to newsletters are grouped together. And if we look at this, all these directories will follow the same general pattern. They all have an index.js file that centralizes all imports. They have a collection.js file that's used to create a collection. And in Vulkan, a collection is just another word for model, kind of a leftover of our MongoDB roots, but model is probably a better word for it. And we might switch to that term eventually. In any case, this is where we create a collection or model named posts. Post type name, this is going to be the GraphQL type name. So whereas our collection is named posts plural, our type is going to be named post singular. Schema, API schema, those will be imported from other places. Permissions, this defines who can do what. So who can read a post? Well, it depends on the post's status. If it's published, if it's published or the current user owns the post or the current user is an admin, then they can access the post. Meaning if it's not published or the current user doesn't own it or they're not an admin, they cannot read the post and it stays private. Who can create a post? Well, any member, meaning any logged in user, can create a post. Who can update a post? Only the post owner. Who can delete it? Only the post owner. And you have a cell. So this is kind of an experimental feature where we pass a component that defines how a post should be displayed anywhere in the app. So the idea behind this is if you have a post on your homepage or in a dashboard or anywhere else, the app will know what a post would look like. And of course, you can tweak it and adapt to different contexts, but it's kind of the, well, when you talk about, for example, design systems, you often have this very component-based approach where it's like, this is what a post looks like, this is what a comment looks like, and this is what we're trying to do here with cells. But more on that later when we look at components. What else do we have here? We have the schema, which is just the list of fields that go into the model. So we have two schemas actually. I think we should have the API schema after, maybe. Oh, maybe not. So never mind about the API schema. We'll look into that later. But the schema is actually very useful in Vulkan because it's used both to generate your API. So your GraphQL API, which you can see here, or at least it's a schema. This is all generated based on the schema you just saw, the JavaScript schema, so you don't have to write all this stuff yourself. So the schema, the JavaScript schema generates your API, but it also helps you generate forms, define callbacks when creating fields, define, options such as how to display the form options when you actually display those forms. What else? Permissions on a field specific basis. So the schema really does a lot, and obviously it's good if you understand all these different properties, but for now just understand the general concept that the schema is the central place where you define your app's behavior, at least how it relates to individual models. And finally, the other very common file that we'll have is a Fragments.js file where we define GraphQL fragments. And fragments are a way of controlling what data you query for in a GraphQL request. So the reason why they are defined here and not collocated with components, as is often the case in GraphQL apps, is because here we are defining them centrally, and then we're able to just invoke them with just their name, right? So it's pretty handy because we can use them in components. We can use them on the server for things like populating our email templates. Registering those fragments centrally with Vulkan instead of simply importing them into our components enables a lot of additional powerful features. And then you'll see the other models follow a very similar schema, or not schema, let's say a pattern, to avoid any confusion. And yeah, that's about it for the overview of this modules directory. Stay tuned for, of course, the server directory coming up next.